Hello, everyone. I am Diego Area, Deputy Director for Strategic Development at the Adrian Ash Latin America Center of the Atlantic Council. I want to thank you all for joining today, both those here in our studios and those joining virtually. I especially want to thank Assistant Secretary Nichols and for his leadership not only on Venezuela, but in addressing other key issues facing our hemisphere. I'll also like to welcome our friends from Congress and the State Department, as well as other key stakeholders of our Venezuela work. Your participation today demonstrates the importance of this moment for the future of Venezuela. At the Atlantic Council, we have been following developments in Venezuela very closely. This year, we have been coordinating with democratic actors in the country in order to support the opposition efforts to advance negotiations. Earlier this year, we published a report on how to overcome obstacles in the implementation of a key humanitarian agreement reached between the opposition and the Maduro government. And we're pleased to see that the United Nations has taken our recommendations into account. I would name this as one of our key accomplishments this year in our Venezuela work. We have also worked to help the democratic opposition consolidate a more unified approach, hosting the leading opposition candidates at the Council during the primaries, including, of course, the winner of that process, Maria Corina Machado. Today's discussion comes at an important time for both Venezuela and the U.S. Both are heading into an electoral season in 2024, and we all know what that means. It also comes on the heels of an historic event in Venezuela. Last month, in a negotiation process that began 2 years ago, the opposition unitary platform coalition reached a critical agreement with the Maduro government on a series of electoral conditions. This Barbados agreement has implications for millions of Venezuelans who are desperate for a peaceful, democratic solution to the country's crisis. However, many questions remain about how to ensure that this agreement is implemented as signed and how the international community can support it. What does this mean for the future of U.S. policy towards Venezuela? What can we expect to see in Venezuela ahead of crucial elections process in 2024? What does this mean for the opposition's hope to make progress in the negotiation process? To answer these questions, we're delighted to be hosting a more detailed look at recent events following the signing of the Barbados Agreement and how the U.S. plans to approach policy towards Venezuela in the coming year. We're honored to have with us today Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere, Brian Nichols. Brian will share with us his perspective and analysis of what we can expect in the months ahead. And then I'm looking forward to his moderated conversation with our senior fellow and Venezuela lead, Jeff Ramsey, to get into more of the policy details at stake. Brian, thank you for joining us to what I'm sure is a very busy time for you and for your team. We look forward to hearing your insights into how the U.S. government is approaching Venezuela in light of recent developments. Brian, I would like to welcome you to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for that warm welcome, Diego. And Jeff, it's great to be with you. And I'm honored to be with all of you here in the room today and those of you who are here virtually through streaming. I see a lot of people who know a hell of a lot about this topic, so I hope that this will be a conversation rather than just me sharing my thoughts on how we support Venezuelans' efforts to rebuild a free, democratic, and prosperous country. As you know, the United States enthusiastically supports the electoral roadmap agreement reached in Barbados, and we believe that this agreement represents a positive step toward addressing the humanitarian, economic, and political crises that affect the stability of Venezuelans, their day-to-day well-being, and the security of our regional partners. Venezuelans deserve a democratic country that protects human rights and provides economic stability and basic freedoms. We believe that the Barbados Electoral Roadmap Agreement is a critical step that will allow Venezuelans to choose their own future. It also represents an alternative to a status quo that did not benefit the Venezuelan people and a situation that simply was not advancing. Ultimately, this process opens the door for the potential normalization of our relationship with Venezuela built on trust and mutual respect, if the Maduro side follows through on its commitments. Since the October 17th signing of the Barbados Electoral Roadmap Agreement, we've witnessed some encouraging developments. These include the release of 5 political prisoners on October 18th, and a primary election that saw millions of Venezuelans turn out to participate in the democratic process. We also welcome the November 30th announcement by the Norwegian facilitators of a process to reinstate all candidates for upcoming elections. While these initial steps in this long process are promising, Nicholas Maduro and his representatives have yet to fully meet the expectations outlined in Secretary Blinken's October 18th statement. The United States has made clear our expectations for Nicholas Maduro and his representatives to define a process for the reinstatement of all candidates and begin the release of wrongfully detained U.S. nationals and Venezuelan political prisoners. Those steps have not taken place. Avon Hernandez, Jarrell Kennemore, and Joseph Cristela, and I would add Savoy Wright, who was recently arrested, are all wrongfully detained by Maduro and his representatives and have been so for far too long. And we continue to insist and advocate every day for their immediate release. And we're pursuing all avenues to secure their freedom. The United States, in coordination with international partners and Venezuelan democratic actors, will assess all actions taken and conduct a review of our sanctions policy in light of our statement that is ongoing. I look forward to meeting tomorrow morning with some of my colleagues on the Hill to ensure that we are taking their insights and concerns into account in this matter. We will suspend sanctions relief if we determine that adequate progress has not been made. How far we restrict or how far we change our sanctions policies will depend on what steps have been taken. We are continuing to engage in conversations with the Maduro representatives, as well as close consultations with the democratic opposition in Venezuela around finding ways to create the conditions for a more democratic, prosperous, and secure Venezuela. We hope to see progress on important areas going forward, such as an audit and an update of the electoral registry in Venezuela, an invitation to agreed upon international election observation missions, steps to ensure access to the media and freedom of movement for political candidates. The international community, civil society, and most importantly, the Venezuelan people will play a vital role in ensuring the successful implementation of these measures as we approach the 2024 election. I want to take a moment to address the concerning actions taken by Maduro and his representatives that threaten this historic agreement. We're specifically concerned about statements and actions targeting the National Primary Commission officials who orchestrated the successful October 22nd Democratic opposition primary. We think it's important to separate the rhetoric, including baseless accusations of fraud in the primary elections, from actions that result in detentions or worse. Similarly, we are concerned about actions that might attempt to destabilize the process, declare primaries invalid, or other things that are utterly unhelpful. On the issue of Essequibo, we encourage Venezuela and Guyana to continue to seek a peaceful resolution of their territorial dispute through the International Court of Justice. Any effort to alter the status quo in this matter through force is entirely unacceptable. Going forward, I want to reiterate that we are fully committed to supporting Venezuela's electoral process and looking for ways to support the prosperity of the Venezuelan people. We're very pleased that progress has taken place with the help of this institution to create the UN Humanitarian Trust Fund for Venezuela. So that's an important step forward. We believe that sanctions relief that leads to better day-to-day living for average Venezuelans is an important step forward and will help address some of the migratory outflows that are destabilizing and impacting communities throughout the region. We see Venezuelans seeking freedom and opportunity in neighboring countries like Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Central America, and the United States. We want to make this a more constructive relationship between our countries, but we have to see progress towards democratic elections, freedom, and respect for fundamental values. We know this is a long process. We have been engaged in these efforts for quite some time. There are fits and starts and up and downs in it, but we're going to keep working hard to help the Venezuelan people achieve a better future. That's a process that has to be led and directed by Venezuelans themselves, while we are engaged robustly in dialogue with the Venezuelan opposition, as well as Maduro authorities about this process and our international partners. At the end of the day, it'll depend on Venezuelans to achieve these goals. As we look toward the future, I hope that we will see a clearer process toward the election going forward, the presence of observers on the ground, greater transparency in how things are administered, and the possibility of real competitive change in that country. We have a long way to go, but this is an important start, and we'll continue to seek a progressive steps toward progress going forward. So I'm going to stop there, and I think this will be a much more dynamic conversation, seeing so many really smart people in the audience.
Well, thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Nichols. I want to echo Diego in saying how absolutely thrilled we are that you're able to join us here today for a conversation on the future of Venezuela policy. At the Atlantic Council over the last few months, as you alluded to, we have been working to support negotiations leading to free and fair elections, whether it was our event series with leading opposition candidates, our report on Venezuela's historic humanitarian accord, or the future of our Venezuela working group in 2024. We're hoping to help contribute to a peaceful democratic solution to the country's crisis. So with that in mind, I was hoping to pick your brain a little bit on the situation in Venezuela, the state of play, as well as what we can expect to see in 2024. On the subject of negotiations, as you mentioned, we saw an important announcement last week. The Maduro government, as a result of negotiations with the unitary platform, announced a process through which opposition candidates, like the primary winner, Maria Corina Machado, can seek to address the bans on their political participation moving forward. What does this mean for the future of negotiations in Venezuela, and what does this mean for free and fair elections in 2024?
Well, it's crucial to have an expeditious and transparent process to authorize her candidacy. The process needs to reach a decision quickly. the Maduro authorities need to demonstrate that they have the courage to allow a serious opposition candidate to run in the election. This can't be just sort of a rubber stamp against a nobody. There's a strong unified opposition candidate. That process needs to conclude by the time of the convoking of the formal election so that both candidates can start from the same starting line.
Thanks, and I think it's important also to note that as you touched on, this is happening in a context in which we see the Maduro government and allies of the government continue to call for a crackdown on dissidents, or whether it's people who question the results of Sunday's referendum, people like independent electoral analyst Eugenio Martinez and others. So I think the context there is important, and following up on that. When we think about elections in 2024, when we think about the kinds of things that we need to see in order for elections in Venezuela to be recognized by the international community, what kinds of conditions do you think we need to see? Is it the ones that are mentioned in the Barbados Agreement between Maduro and the Unitary Platform? Are there certain key priorities here that we should be paying attention to? What do free and fair elections look like in 2024 in Venezuela?
Well, I think free and fair elections look like what free and fair elections look like everywhere, which is there has to be a level playing field with access to the media, access to an equitable access to resources to finance campaigns. There has to be an ability to move around the country and openly campaign without fear of reprisals or violence. There should be widespread access for international observers from a variety of different institutions. I think that's very important. There should be an audit of the electoral rolls so that people know who the voters are, and that's clear. There needs to be transparency in the voting process to ensure that votes cast are counted in the way that they are cast. So, there are other things that I'm sure experts could name, but those are just a few of the things that I think are true in all countries.
Talking about that, we see in Venezuela the existence of what Venezuelan human rights organizations have pointed to, which is around 275 Venezuelan political prisoners, and then several Americans who are wrongfully detained. You mentioned Avon Hernandez, Gerald Kennemore, Joseph Ryan Cristela. I know that you and Special Envoy Roger Carstens have been very involved in following these cases. Is there space for out-of-the-box thinking as we work to ensure the continued releases of detained Americans and Venezuelan political prisoners moving forward?
Well, I think there's always space for out-of-the-box thinking. I'd like to hear your out-of-the-box thinking.
Well, as we think about, you mentioned there's ongoing channels of communication with Caracas. I mean, is there a way to sort of continue to emphasize the importance of the release of these individuals moving forward?
Well, that's something that we do every day. This is incredibly important to the president, to Secretary Blinken, to our entire foreign policy team. The welfare of American citizens all over the world is vital to us. We've raised the issue with the Maduro authorities continually, and without progress in this area, a normal relationship with Venezuela is not possible.
Let's turn now to the region. We see countries across the region interested in playing a role in supporting negotiations and supporting a democratic solution to Venezuela's crisis. Is there a way for these countries, U.S. allies and other friends of Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, and others, to contribute to the negotiations process as it moves forward? Or are there other contributions that can be made from countries in the region that maybe are better coming from Latin America than from where we sit today in Washington?
Well, I think the role of our partners in the region is vital. I see some friendly diplomats here in the audience who've been engaged on this issue, and their governments have regular and dynamic conversations with Maduro and those around him. I think that's very valuable. I think the expectation that a free and fair election is something that this hemisphere values is crucial. And there's no reason why Venezuela should be different than the other countries in our hemisphere, particularly its closest neighbors. All have competitive, dynamic elections. And when their leaders say, hey, I stand for election, I face the voters, that's something that resonates with their counterparts. I think that expanding the aperture a little bit, our colleagues in the European Union and the UK and Canada also have an important role to play, and we talk to them all frequently about the process of implementing the Barbados Agreement, how we can align our efforts to demonstrate to both of the parties that we want to see this process succeed, but there are costs if there's not clear progress, and that demands diplomatic agility as we move forward. So we're in regular contact with them, pretty much on a weekly basis.
Well, that's important. Thanks for sharing. Assistant Secretary, I want to echo your appreciation of our audience and their brilliance, both here in the room and those of you watching us online. The title of our event here was a conversation with you. So I want to encourage people, if they have any questions, to submit them via our app, via askac.org. Those of you that are here in the room can pull that up on your cell phones. Those of you that are viewing online, feel free to submit your written questions to askac.org. They'll pop up here on this very tablet, and look forward to more of an engaging conversation. Before we take questions from the audience, I did have one last question for you, which is related to the flow of migrants and refugees. How do you see the continued flow of Venezuelans from the country as the crisis continues into 2024? How is the U.S. working to address the humanitarian needs of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, whether it's those who arrive at our southern border or the Venezuelans that have fled to other countries in the region?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. We provide holistic assistance through the U.S. Agency for International Development, through different migration-related international organizations like IOM. The efforts that we are undertaking through the Los Angeles Agreement on Migration and Protection, those are ways that we can address this. And that means helping countries implement their own temporary protected status agreements for Venezuelan migrants. They involve providing support to the communities that host migrants. That involves training migration-related officials on how to humanely and respectfully process migrants in the different ways that migration authorities interact with them. That involves coordinating on the removal of migrants who do not have a lawful reason to be in a certain location, dismantling the networks that smuggle migrants along the routes that take them both northward and to other places in South America. And I think also vital is providing legal pathways so that people who wish to immigrate can do so in a legal way through things like our CNVH parole program for Cubans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Haitians, through the CBP-1 application, the H-2 visa program. Those are all ways that the United States promotes legal pathways, and we have safe mobility offices that we've opened in some of the countries in the region to help people access those resources for legal migration.
Thank you. That's important. We have some good questions lined up here. Thanks to those of you that have already submitted. I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Assistant Secretary Nichols, you can ask them via our app, askac.org. Our first question here is from Ambassador Kevin Whitaker, who's also a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. He's asking about the presence of illegal actors along the border between Colombia and Venezuela, and noting that Venezuelan Defense Minister Padrino Lopez and his Colombian counterpart, Colombian Minister Velázquez, just met for the first time in some time, and border security was reportedly on the agenda. How does the U.S. view these conversations? And I might add, how does the U.S. view the role of Colombia in working towards a peaceful, democratic solution to the crisis?
Well, getting a question from the extremely long-tenured former U.S. ambassador to Colombia, I couldn't possibly educate him. But what I would say is, as Kevin knows, the Venezuelan authorities have had, over a long period of administrations, have had an important role in the security of Colombia. And illegal armed groups in Colombia have sought refuge in Venezuela. Some have received that refuge in a formal status. In other times, the border is porous and it's hard for the Venezuelans to enforce their influence along the border. So those groups have been able to operate with some impunity in that region. Pressure from Maduro and those around him on those illegal armed groups to cooperate in a peace process with Colombia as part of the total peace effort that President Petro has undertaken, I think is important. Coordination between the two countries on their mutual security, I think is important conversations for them to have. Note that Brazil recently hosted a meeting of all the defense chiefs of South America, and those types of conversations to promote exchanges are very important, not just on that border, but throughout the region.
Mm-hmm. And we also saw the conference in April that the Petro administration hosted in efforts to try to support negotiations. I mean, is there more of a concrete role for Colombia in the negotiation space as well?
Well, I think Colombia plays an important role in these conversations. I think that they have the ability to address the concerns of both Maduro authorities and the opposition. We know that during the conflict in Colombia, literally millions of Colombians moved to Venezuela over the course of decades, and now that process has reversed. And so each country has a deep interest in the welfare of the other, and there are family relationships on both sides of the border that are very important. So President Petro, Foreign Minister Leiva, expressing their views with their counterparts about the importance of a democratic path forward. President Petro's been somebody who's been an advocate of Venezuela abiding by the inter-American system and its different institutions. We think that's positive. So I think they can play an important and positive role.
Thank you. Our next question here is from a friend of the Atlantic Council and longtime Venezuelan humanitarian activist, Feliciano Reina. He's founder of Acción Solidaria, a leading humanitarian organization in the country. He asks, in November of last year, the Democratic Opposition and Maduro government signed a humanitarian agreement, which would use sanctioned funds to benefit the humanitarian emergency, which you just mentioned. How do you see the implementation of this humanitarian accord moving forward? And to what extent could this impact the needs of struggling Venezuelans?
Well, I think it's quite important because it allows the frozen assets of the state of Venezuela around the world to be used to provide humanitarian assistance through UN institutions in a transparent and verifiable way. I think that's incredibly important to avoid misuse by anyone. And that means that the resources can arrive directly in the hands of those who need it most within Venezuela, addressing concerns like malnutrition, access to some type of viable economic activity, healthcare. Venezuela's health institutions have deteriorated enormously over the last 20 years. So all of those areas, I think, are very important. What's required now is an agreement between the Maduro side and the opposition on exactly which resources will be tapped for this purpose, and then to obtain the approval of whatever the relevant government that has control of those assets is, so that they could be transferred into the trust fund.
Thank you for that. I want to remind everybody that those of you in the audience and those of you who are watching online can submit questions to Assistant Secretary Nichols on the future of the search for a democratic solution in Venezuela using our app at askac.org. We have one here actually following up on the Humanitarian Fund. We have a question anonymous here asking, have the Venezuelan parties approved of the Humanitarian Fund structure that the UN proposed? Is there a projected timeline on when funds might be deployed to help people in need?
Well, I know that both sides had received the draft terms of reference. Beyond that, I do not know what a timeline there for its deployment, but it's certainly something that we look to the UN to do all it can to expedite the process.
Appreciate that, and I want to encourage anybody curious about the status of the humanitarian agreement and the specifics to go online to the Atlantic Council website and search for our most recent report, which we issued in September, outlining some recommendations to address bottlenecks in the implementation of that agreement. We have a question here from Ambassador Jaitzel Roman, who's asking, if progress in Venezuela fails, how does this impact U.S. priorities across the hemisphere? What's the regional importance of the Venezuelan crisis today at a moment when it seems like there's competing global priorities?
Well, I think in a number of ways. We've already talked about the impact of migration on Venezuela's neighbors. So if this crisis continues, we're going to see continued elevated levels of emigration from Venezuela. If there is not progress toward a competitive election in Venezuela, I think we're going to see a continued deterioration of the institutions of the state in Venezuela. So that means poor services for average Venezuelans and a continued humanitarian and social acute crisis inside Venezuela, and having millions of people in our hemisphere subjected to that is deeply problematic. We could also see the Maduro authorities acting in unpredictable ways that could destabilize its neighbors. Obviously, the tensions along the border between Venezuela and Guyana have been something that many people have been concerned about over the course of the last few months in the run-up to the referendum. And I think you addressed that in some of your remarks to the media over the last couple of days. But how that impacts the region, it would be a serious concern. The facilitation of illicit activity through Venezuela, drug trafficking, illegal artisanal gold mining, trafficking in persons, those are all problematic issues, and without improved governance, those will probably continue and expand.
Mm-hmm. So that's the worst case scenario. Following up on that, I did want to ask, you mentioned key electoral conditions. You mentioned the update of the electoral registry, the process through which bans against opposition political participation can be addressed, a number of other things that I know the European Union has also highlighted in its recommendations from its most recent electoral observation mission. But beyond elections, this process, these negotiations that began in August of 2021 between the Unitary Platform and Maduro's representatives, it's a pretty broad 7-point agenda in there, at least as it's outlined in the initial memorandum of understanding as this process began. What are some other things that you think could be or need to be successfully addressed in order to resolve Venezuela's crisis beyond just elections? I mean, there's elections, there's a humanitarian component, but is there room for conversations around truth and reconciliation? Is there space for transitional justice or judicial reforms? I mean, what other elements would we need to see to envision a real opportunity in Venezuela in 2024?
Well, as you think about the election period, it doesn't end in just happiness for everyone. What it ends in is a government, and hopefully a government that's democratically elected. And having a broad agreement on governance and not taking reprisals against the other side, things like ensuring that basic freedoms are respected so that there aren't, I think Foro Penal's number that you cited is 274 political prisoners in Venezuela. Ending those types of practices and restoring the democratic norms in that country. In a Venezuela that has had a transparent democratic election, you have the opportunity for international investment and a much broader scale. You have the confidence of the international community. You have the potential for normal relations with the United States and other countries around the world, a really positive transformation in that country. But to get there, key steps like increasing transparency in government institutions, addressing the issues of corruption and rule of law are vital. The court system is not transparent. It does not respond to the normal incentives and actions that the judiciary does in a democratic country. All those things need to be addressed going forward, and there needs to be a broad dialogue among Venezuelans about how to accomplish those goals.
That's important. I think it's as you highlight, it's about more than just elections. It's about getting to the root of this crisis and restoring Venezuela's democratic institutions across the board. We have a question here from Catherine Schmidt, who's asking about another side of this, the energy sector and the private sector perspective of all of this. She's asking, new trade data shows that the U.S. was the top destination for Venezuelan crude in November for the first time since sanctions relief. What are the oil market implications of sanctions relief? How do you see that playing into this equation? How do you perceive the U.S. balancing, broader geopolitical or energy concerns with the need to keep the eyes on the ball with regard to democracy and human rights in Venezuela?
Well, I think that's a great question. Historically, the United States is the largest partner for Venezuela's energy sector. Under the sanctions period, sanctions evasion has driven oil production into illicit trade, largely with the PRC, but also with some others, including Iran. What we're seeing now is the illicit trade moving back into the formal sector after many years of being out of the formal sector. That is a positive as it avoids this product going to China and Iran. It is better for the Venezuelan people, and since when the oil was sold in the black market, there was a 30 to 35% discount in the price, and it's good for U.S. consumers because we're getting oil and other products that we need into our markets. The future. We will have to see how that plays out because right now, while I think the production has moved toward the United States, we have not seen much of a change in the level of production. So the market has changed, but it's they have not yet increased their production significantly, as for at least the most recent data that I saw.
Thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary. We have one more question here from Maria Angela Jimenez, who's asking about the role. What do you see the role of Venezuelan civil society in the future of Venezuela's negotiations process? It's a good question. You know, there is skepticism in some corners in Venezuela with regard to negotiations. We've seen some processes in the past, fail to reach a meaningful solution to the crisis. Is there a role for more engagement with civil society in these negotiations, if and when they move forward? As we talk about moving beyond just elections, how can Venezuelans across the country who are interested in having an impact on the negotiations, how can they ensure that their concerns, that their voice is heard?
Well, the negotiations have gone through the unitary platform in Venezuela, and Gerardo Blyde, as the lead negotiator, has done really heroic, incredible work to get the full spectrum of the opposition to agree around a way forward. That was no easy task in any political system. And they've made tremendous strides. There's now a candidate selected by 2.4 million Venezuelan voters, Maria Corina Machado, and her views on the way forward now take on tremendous importance because she is the elected candidate of the opposition voters in Venezuela. I think that's going to be the major change going forward, is making sure that her views are taken into account as the leading opposition candidate. Civil society plays an important role in a democracy in pointing out key issues, offering up suggested solutions, raising concerns that aren't being addressed by the political system at times. But an election is a political process. We have a candidate on both sides identified effectively. We'll see probably in January the convoking, certainly by the end of January, I would expect the convoking of a formal election with an electoral calendar. And hopefully the rights of civil society members to speak out and point out the issues that they're concerned about will be something that will be debated extensively in the electoral process, and also will inform the international community's engagement with all the actors in Venezuela.
Well, I want to thank you, Assistant Secretary Nichols, for taking the time to be with here today. I want to thank all of you for joining us. We know that 2024 will bring some opportunities as well as many challenges in Venezuela. Certainly hope to see progress both in negotiations and towards free and fair elections. Hope to see the convening of that electoral timetable soon, as you just highlighted. We at the Atlantic Council, we know that the coming year is going to be a key year for the future of Venezuela. So whether it's the work of our Venezuela Working Group, our Congressional Fellowship Program, or our continued work in and around the negotiation space, we will be following this closely, as I know all of you will as well. So we'll have more to announce in this space. Stay tuned. And I want to thank you again, Assistant Secretary Nichols, for being with us. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, Jeff. You didn't ask me any questions.